sexy guys do. Explore what's all in their minds. Thinking about a thing or two, about a thing or two, about a thing or two. Mansplaining is deciding you're gonna search for the truth. Mansplain me, baby. Mansplain. There can be no thinking that would be uncool.
Welcome to Mansplaining, a podcast about the interesting things you can discover if you just take the time to learn. My name is Joe. I'm the host for this week, and as always, I'm joined by my college friend Mark. Together, we'll explore what's on our minds, and like the song says, hopefully figure out a thing or two about a thing or two. Mark, I wanted to do a kind of odd take on immigration this week. Not the immigration mess that Washington is consumed by and the two parties have been buried in for a better part of a decade now, but some non-human immigration, some immigrant vegetables or fruits, as at least one of them is known as. And maybe this is just my joint Irish-Italian heritage, but I was talking to my wife and thinking a lot about how the tomato and the potato, both of which are native to the Americas, became like culinary superstars in Europe. I think you can fairly call them the staple foods of Ireland and Italy, respectively. And it begs the question, how did these two foods migrate from the New World to the Old World and then just take over the cuisine of those countries I mentioned? I suspect it's a very interesting story, and so I sent you off to track down the story, and I'm interested to talk to you about this and also kind of excited that we're doing a topic that's well off the beaten path of politics and culture and science and tech that we usually discuss. So I hope it was interesting for you, and I am looking forward to what you have to say about this.
Well, yes, it was interesting, and thank you for the question. I think the best mansplaining questions are the ones in which finding an answer is like peeling an onion. Everything you learn leads to new and unexpected layers of additional discoveries that are lying beneath the surface. And
yes,
just
agreed.
like the noble potato growing underground, this is one of those topics where what you can see at first glance is only the beginning. So let's go back to those beginnings. The ancestors of modern tomatoes originated in the Andes Mountains of modern-day Peru, Ecuador, and northern Chile, where they grew wild. Over time, these plants migrated north into Central and Southern America, and the tomato was first domesticated around 500 BC in Mexico by the Maya and Aztec peoples. The Aztec name for the plant, tomatl, was where we get the word tomato from.
Now, that's already interesting.
Right. Potatoes were first domesticated much earlier, somewhere between 8,000 and 5,000 BCE, so about 10,000 years ago. This also was in the Andes, where tomatoes originated, and recently, evolutionary biologists have suggested that the potato originated millions of years ago when a distant ancestor of the tomato naturally interbred with tuberosum, which is a potato-like plant native to South America. This resulted in a new plant that, for the first time, grew underground stems that swole into tubers, otherwise known as potatoes. And if you're wondering whether we also get the word potato from the Aztecs, no, that has a different origin. The very first indigenous peoples that Christopher Columbus encountered in the New World were the Taino people of the Caribbean, and the Taino term for sweet potato was batata, which the Spaniards adopted as patata. Anyway, if you've ever found yourself in a grocery produce section puzzling over which came first, the tomato or the potato, now you know it was the tomato. And this hybridization happened to coincide with the geological uplift of the Andes mountain range, which over the course of 4 million years created new harsh environments characterized by cold, dry, and high-altitude habitats, environments that the potato plant was well equipped to survive, because its underground tubers store energy, water, and nutrients that allow the plant to persist through seasons not conducive to growth. The ability of the potato to thrive in cold weather will be important later, so hold on to that fact. The tomato and the potato are both members of the nightshade family, another fact that will be important later. In fact, they are so closely related that today people are cultivating so-called pomatos, which are created by grafting tomato stems onto a potato plant so that the pomato grows tomatoes above ground and potatoes below ground.
Oh, that's interesting.
In South and Mesoamerican cultures prior to the arrival of Europeans, both potatoes and tomatoes were important parts of the local diet, but far more so the potato, which was the principal energy source for the indigenous peoples of the Andes. Tomatoes were appreciated for their color and flavor, and they are a good source of vitamins A and C, but potatoes are particularly nutritious. They contain carbohydrates, fiber, potassium, and vitamins C and B. The potato is, as a matter of fact, able to sustain life better than any other single food, a third fact that will be important later in our story. The plant was, as a result, critical to the diet of the Incan peoples, who learned various techniques of preserving potatoes to ensure food security and provide supplies for their armies. Two Incan methods of preserving potatoes are preserved in the sources. Chuño was the most frequent method. The Incans would dehydrate potatoes by repeatedly freezing them, then thawing them to extract water before mashing them. Chuño could be stored for years without refrigeration, which made it a vital supply for Incan armies and a lifeline during times of famine or bad harvests. Tocash, meanwhile, was prepared by boiling, peeling, chopping, and then fermenting potatoes underwater for 6 to 12 months. Tocash is still made to this day among Peruvian peoples who believe it has antibacterial qualities as well as aiding in digestion and being effective against inflammation and other diseases. You can find YouTube videos about tocash, which reportedly has a strong odor and a flavor comparable to certain strong cheeses that's been described as, quote, an assault on the senses, unquote. When Europeans arrived on the scene, they encountered a number of foodstuffs that are common today but would have been completely new to the average European. Major foods brought from the New World to Europe include corn or maize, chili peppers, vanilla, cocoa, pumpkin, squash, beans, peanuts, pineapples and other tropical fruit, sweet potatoes, turkeys, avocado, cranberries, blueberries, and sunflower seeds.
Wow.
Given that tobacco was also a New World import to Europe, the discovery of the Americas had an enormous impact on European culture, diet, and agricultural diversity.
That's a lot of contributions. And in exchange for that, the Europeans gave them smallpox, right?
I was thinking exactly the same. Yes, we will take your bounty and give to you disease and racism. The very first mention of the potato in European sources was in 1537 in a document recorded in Peru. And the first potatoes arrived in Spain around 1570, making it to England and Ireland about 20 years later. The tomato first touched Italian soil around 1544 when a printed Italian source made reference to the new pomodoro, or golden apples. So, Joe, any guess why tomatoes were known as golden apples?
I can guess that maybe their original color was more gold or orange, and I'm guessing that because I know there's some indigenous carrots that were purple grown in the Americas, so that's my guess.
Quality guess. They were yellow at the time, and so they were known as golden apples when they first appeared. And initially, Europeans were not welcoming of these new plants. I mentioned earlier that both potatoes and tomatoes are members of the nightshade family, which is a large family encompassing about 2,600 species worldwide, about half of which are poisonous to one degree or another. One notorious example is belladonna, also known as deadly nightshade, which is one of the most toxic plants known to humans. Eating just 2 or 3 berries can kill a child. Even handling the plant without gloves can be dangerous, as the toxins can be absorbed through the skin. When the potato and tomato first landed on European shores, botanists noticed that both had physical similarities to Old World nightshades, such as belladonna, including similar flower structure, berry-like fruit, and distinctive foliage. As a result, it was a widespread assumption that both plants were poisonous. Potatoes, in fact, were sometimes referred to as devil's apples and said to be the creation of witches, particularly since the potato very suspiciously grows beneath ground, unlike good, God-fearing vegetables that are unafraid of the light. Because the potato was not mentioned in the Bible, Scottish Presbyterians condemned it as unbiblical. There were rumors that eating potatoes could cause diseases like leprosy, probably because potatoes were thought to resemble a leper's deformed fingers and toes. If potatoes were cultivated at all, it was simply as livestock feed. The tomato, meanwhile, was grown as an ornamental plant, prized for its colorful fruit by Europe's elite. But there was belief that a single touch of a tomato on the lips was enough to kill you. And in fact, the leaves and vines of the tomato plant are fairly toxic, so this belief was not entirely without substance. What was entirely without substance was a belief in the 16th and 17th centuries that eating tomatoes could turn you into a werewolf. You will note, Joe, a contradiction here. Plants that were commonly consumed as food in the Americas were written off as poisonous in the Old World. At first look, it seems kind of dumb. The whole reason these plants were brought to Europe in the first place is because they were food, and yet right away Europeans were convinced that you should never eat them. This is likely the result of a number of factors. First, there was the chain of transmission. The crops from the New World were passed along to Europe by sailors, merchants, and naturalists, and often in the process they were stripped of culinary context and knowledge. How to prepare them, how to make them taste good, and so on. Also, Renaissance physicians in general were not in favor of eating your vegetables. There was a belief dating back to the classical medical sources, still influential at the time, that vegetables harmed the body and sapped mental vitality. If you ate vegetables in this time period, it was likely because you were so poor that you didn't have a choice. And then there was good old-fashioned prejudice. The people of the New World were assumed to be ignorant savages, barely above animals. And so there would have been a serious stigma attached to eating like a savage. You might feed New World plants to your livestock, but no self-respecting member of society would want them served for dinner.
And that third answer was the one I was going to prefer myself. So I'm not surprised to hear that as an explanation.
Right, neither was I. In short, initially the deck was stacked against tomatoes and potatoes becoming an important part of European cuisine. And in fact, it took 200 years and some seriously high-powered backing before things started to turn around, and Europeans managed to relearn what indigenous Americans already knew. The potato, because of its nutritious qualities, started to gain royal backing. In Prussia, King Frederick the Great issued a mandate in 1756, the Kartoffelbefehl, which means potato order. This order mandated potato cultivation so that peasants would have food if enemy armies invaded during the War of the Austrian Succession. Like many military leaders of the time, he thought a real advantage of the potato over other crops is it grows underground, where it's kind of covert, and invading armies would be less likely to plunder them. Due to his vigorous promotion of the potato, Frederick the Great was sometimes known as the Kartoffelkönig, or Potato King, though I seriously wonder if anyone called him that to his face. Over in France, suspicion of potatoes was deep enough that it took another act of royal patronage to turn it around. In order to encourage consumption of potatoes, King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette began wearing potato blossoms in their daily attire, while Marie Antoinette wore a headdress of potato flowers at a fancy dress ball. And this worked. The irresistible urge to suck up to the royal family meant that the potato was now officially in among French society, and the road had been paved for French fries to become America's all-time favorite French import. Meanwhile, over in Italy, the first recorded mention of gnocchi made from potatoes, rather than bread or flour, was in the late 18th century, shortly after these international acts of royal patronage. By the second half of the 19th century, the potato was a standard element of Italian cuisine. In Ireland, meanwhile, the rise of the potato was a consequence of two other factors: cold weather and crushing poverty. Potatoes were first domesticated near the equator, where days generally have 12 hours of sunlight. When they were first planted in mainland Europe, long summer days confused the potato plant, causing the tubers to only grow later in the autumn when it was too close to the early winter frost to survive. Ireland doesn't have this problem. Falls in Ireland are cool but frost-free, and the potato's tolerance of cold allowed it to thrive in northern European climates. Meanwhile, Irish peasants were struggling under a system of land management in which landowners, most of whom lived in England, forced them onto smaller and smaller parcels of land and set rents so high that they had to sell pretty much the entire produce of their farms simply to make rent, with most of the grain cultivated in Ireland in the 18th century exported to England. To feed their families, Irish peasants needed something that could grow in small gardens that would be high in nutrients and calories. Enter the potato. As I mentioned before, potatoes are so nutritious that you don't need to eat much else. If you combine potatoes with milk or buttermilk, you can live on that alone. Your diet may be extremely monotonous, but you'll survive. And movie buffs will know that this was a fundamental feature of the Matt Damon movie The Martian, in which a man gets stranded on Mars and survives for a year by growing potatoes within the base.
I suspected that the ubiquity of potatoes in Ireland had something to do with the poverty, because I'm thinking, just based on things we know about the potato today, very hearty food and highly caloric, like you've already said, but also cheap, right? I assume they must have been cheap 200 years ago. And then even a third thing, they don't spoil, or they take forever to spoil. So I'm guessing that all those things together made it a real bountiful crop for the Irish back in the day.
An absolute lifesaver, but kind of a double-edged sword, as we'll be getting to.
Attention mansplaining listeners. If you want to engage with Mark and me, you have some options. One is to go to our Facebook page, Mansplaining the Podcast, where you can leave a comment or question, check our sources, suggest topics for future episodes, or just like us, because who doesn't want to be liked? You can also reach us through whatever app you use to listen to this podcast by giving us a 5-star rating or writing a review of your favorite episode. Or you can call and leave us a message on our dedicated voicemail box, which is 206-486-4074. And did you know that you can now listen to full episodes of Mansplaining on YouTube and check out our podcast music on Spotify? Yep, it's true. Just type Mansplaining Podcast into the search bar on either platform and you'll find us. It's lonely in podcast land, and we welcome and appreciate any feedback you might want to share. Act now, and we'll throw in a set of Ginsu knives. Not really.
An adult laborer in Ireland at the time would have eaten as much as 14 pounds of potatoes every day, with milk and sometimes fish as supplements. And this worked for a while, but it was a recipe for disaster. Because of the potatoes' high caloric content, population in Ireland exploded. The population increased from about 2 million people in 1700 to 8 million by the mid-19th century. Increased population meant peasants were working smaller and smaller plots of land, which only increased the dietary importance of the potato. Potatoes were also used as food for livestock, which meant most of Ireland's population depended entirely on this one plant. And potatoes are not conventionally grown from seeds. Instead, you cut off pieces of the potato that contain eyes or sprouts and plant that. As a result, there's very little genetic diversity among the potatoes. When times are good, this is beneficial. Good potatoes sprout more good potatoes. However, this also means that a genetically uniform crop of potatoes, like the lumper potato in Ireland, can be very vulnerable to disease. And one such disease, the potato blight, led to the famous Irish potato famine. Crop failures and the ensuing starvation and disease resulted in the death of 1 million people between 1845 and 1852. 1 million people within 7 years, while millions more emigrated to other parts of the world. In the mid-19th century, the population in Ireland was 8.5 million people. By 1901, 50 years later, it was a little over half that. So the potato, you
Wow.
could say, was directly responsible for Ireland's population both growing that high and also falling that low.
And I would add the being under the yoke of the British oppressors
Oh, yeah.
gave the Irish no choice but to keep growing potatoes because they had no chance of ascending in class status.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, all those terrorist acts committed by the Irish Republican Army and the continuing feeling among many that Ireland needs to be independent from England is still rooted in the ongoing memories and historical belief that England just allowed Irish people to die when they were starving instead of
That's right.
making significant efforts to save them.
Yes, agreed.
Poverty also had a role to play in the tomato finally becoming a European foodstuff after 200 years of suspicion and disuse. The Mediterranean climate proved ideal for the cultivation of tomatoes, and by the early 1600s, tomatoes as foods start to show up in Spanish writings and plays, particularly in sauces and stews. One Spanish condiment spread on bread and meats was prepared by frying tomatoes with eggplant, squash, and onions. The tomato first gained an Italian foothold in Naples, which at the time was under Spanish rule, and so was ground zero for the intersection of Spanish and Italian cuisines. The poor in Naples also lacked access to meat, and likewise were not receiving misinformation from aristocratic physicians, so they were more open to give the tomato a chance than were their wealthier contemporaries. The first Italian recipes to feature tomatoes were copies of Spanish originals, but a 1692 cookbook from Naples was the first to mention the tomato as an ingredient in an Italian dish. By the early 1700s, dietitians had finally reversed field and were writing that tomatoes, when properly cooked, could serve as a digestive aid and an important source of nutrition. The first mention of a tomato sauce in Italy dates to 1790, and about the same time Neapolitan peasants started baking sliced tomatoes on top of their flatbreads, the earliest precursor to the pizza. Tomatoes with pasta entered the lexicon in a recipe written in Naples in the early 1800s, while the first reference to spaghetti and tomato sauce was published in 1844. The tight identification of the tomato with Italy, though, had as much to do with politics as it did with flavor. I mentioned earlier that the first tomatoes in Europe were yellow, the origin of the Italian term for tomatoes, which literally means golden apples. Cultivation of the tomato in the ensuing centuries, however, had produced the red tomato that's famous today. When Italian nationalism became a thing in the 19th century, the tomato was embraced as a unifying symbol of Italian cuisine, since it distinguished Italian cuisine from French and Austrian foods. The tomato was also known for its bright red fruit by this point, and red was one of the three colors in the Italian flag. Dishes like pizza margherita and the caprese salad were designed to incorporate red, white, and green ingredients, that is to say, tomato, mozzarella, and basil or pesto, to signal the colors of the flag and reinforce Italian national pride. Coincidentally, this was also the time period when canning vegetables first became a thing. The first Italian cannery was built in 1875, and Italian tomatoes came to be shipped all over the world. As Italian immigrants arrived in the U.S. and other regions, they brought Italian cuisine with them. And even if they ended up in cold weather parts of the world, they were able to prepare traditional Italian dishes with canned tomatoes shipped from the mother country. And so the tomato made a round trip, from the New World to the Old World and back again. Both the potato and the tomato arrived on European shores as objects of suspicion, poisonous tools of the devil, in fact. But by the time they came back, they were absolutely fundamental to European cuisine and had played a significant role in its history as well. In 1995, the humble potato even traveled to space, becoming the first vegetable to be grown successfully in orbit. So who knows where tomatoes and potatoes will go from here, but if history is any indication, it's going to be one hell of a ride.
You know, at the end, when you were talking about the various recipes with tomatoes in Italy, I was thinking to myself, because you had, in an earlier section, you talked about some of the things the Incas did with potatoes. I'm thinking to myself, what kind of record keeping do we really have about the way the civilizations around the Andes and Mesoamerica used potatoes and tomatoes. For all we know, I'm guessing they may have invented their own mashed potato or fried potato or tomato sauce, and that the Italian invention is really a reinvention. What do you think of that idea?
Oh, I think that's almost a certainty that if you've got potatoes, there's going to be some that you can prepare straight out of the ground. And then you're going to lay some others off and turn them into these things that can be preserved for years at a time. But that's not going to mean the entire crop. So, yeah, I would expect that there were baked potatoes or mashed potatoes. I don't know that there were French fries because I'm not sure the Andes people cooked in oil. But there's no doubt in my mind that they were preparing potatoes and tomatoes, for that matter, in a variety of ways that simply did not enter into the records at the time. Mashed potatoes isn't the sort of thing that a historian is going to talk about, right? If the potato is providing the food for an army that's invading a neighboring region, maybe then it shows up. If the potato is being paid as a form of tax, then it's going to show up in the records. And so we get only these partial glimpses, and there's no doubt that there would have been other uses and manifestations of that record.
Right. I got a couple other things when you mentioned how vegetables were associated with poor people. That made me think that poor people were limited to eating vegetables and you needed to be rich to eat meat, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and also certain types of bread might have been limited to the elite, depending on how difficult or restricted the access to that grain was. That generally speaking,
Right.
Poor people eat what they're able to eat, and rich people eat what they want to eat. And so that within the aristocratic circles, you can have prohibitions against vegetables because they had so many other options at their disposal. But if you're starving, you're going
Right.
to eat whatever you can get into your mouth.
Right. And then you talked about the pomato, the genetic hybrid, and thank goodness we live in a age now where you can do things like that the Irish in 1847 would have really benefited from something like that, Now that we know that the tomato is the ancestor of the potato, we can do things with genetics to create new strains of potatoes that are hardier and not have this inbred food that is so vulnerable to extinction whenever there's a blight.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, I'll preface that by saying that the pomato is not a genetic hybrid. It is one plant that's grafted onto another plant. So it's kind of like an apple tree that has more than one type of apple in it. But you are totally right that we do live in an age where genetic modification is a possibility, and you can, in a lab, create a type of plant that's better in cold weather or better with less water, that sort of thing. And what that puts in my head is that we have not yet done an episode on GMOs, which is
Yes.
probably something that we'll come around to sooner or later.
Yes, right. I feel like when we joked about the trade that happened after the time of Columbus, where the Europeans took away all these amazing foods, vanilla and chocolate and corn and potatoes and tomatoes, and left smallpox as payment in full. That's not quite true. Just to correct the record here, they also brought livestock, right? And I think rice and even wheat comes from the old world and obviously became big crops in the new world. Yeah. So it wasn't a completely unfair exchange, but the smallpox really is a black mark on that exchange, and the native peoples got the worst of it, I would say.
Oh, no doubt about that. They got the worst of quite a few things.
Right. Okay, and finally, you didn't say anything about the origin story for Mr. Potato Head. Did that also originate in the Andes, is what I'm wondering.
I don't want to open myself up to lawsuit because the Potato Head family is very litigious. It did not show up in my research. I will say I'm saddened for the youth of today who only know the plastic Mr. Potato Head. I grew up, I
Yes.
had a Mr. Potato Head. You used an actual potato on that. And there were like ears and a nose and a hat with very sharp points on the other side that you would stick into the potato.
Yes.
No doubt children were maimed by this, which is why it's now an entirely plastic endeavor. But at the time, like I was there for
Yes.
the OG Mr. Potato Head.
And Mrs. Potato Head too. So perhaps we'll
Yes.
pick that up in another episode of Mansplaining. Well, thank you. That was a really interesting conversation. I kind of knew it would be, and I'm ready for the question for next time. Hit me.
Okay. So back when this podcast was young, I asked you a question about Christmas. And that's still one of our most popular episodes of all time. So now I have a
Yes.
question about another holiday, Halloween. It strikes me that Halloween is kind of unique among holidays in America, where popular holidays are usually Christian or patriotic or both in the case of Thanksgiving. Halloween has so many pre-Christian and non-Christian elements that every October it gets denounced by hardcore Christians, and yet somehow it's not only survived in this country, it's thrived. So my question for you, how did Halloween become such a big deal in America? And what does the holiday's enduring popularity say about what our country actually stands for?
That's a good question. I'm going to posit a quick answer like you did when I asked you this potato-tomato question. Your immediate reaction is, well, they're delicious. That's why they were adopted by their...
And you think it's
their...
so you're going to say that
I
the
think-
candy is what's driving Halloween's success?
No, I was going to say something different. It's fun. The quickie hot take. It's a fun holiday, so it's probably that is a reason why it survived all the doctrinaire religious attempts to beat it into submission.
But that's one of the things that's kind of quirky and puzzling and interesting for me is, yes, it's a fun holiday, but it's also a holiday that's about death. And generally speaking, death isn't fun except on Halloween when it's totally fun. So this is this is a holiday with a lot of contradictions, and so I think it would be really interesting to get into it.
Yeah, and since we're in October, it's perfect timing too. So I will get on that, Mark. And in a few weeks, Mansplaining listeners, you will have an answer to that question. In the meantime, I would like to encourage people to post their favorite potato or tomato-based recipes to our Facebook page, Mansplaining the Podcast.
Yeah.
But for now,
looking forward to that.
That was Mark, and I'm Joe, and we will see you next time.
Back to you next time.
You came from far horizons, suspicious, strange, obscene. A knobbly little tuber, a fruit of golden sheen. They said you'd bring us madness or make our bodies sprout. Leprosy and werewolves, best to throw you out. We kept you at arm's length for 200 years, clutching garlic to our bosoms, murmuring our fears. But famine makes a bargain and poverty's a flirt. We tasted just a nibble, and oh, it did not hurt. Impossible to trust you, impossible to deny. We brought you to our tables with a mostly guilty sigh. From cellar to cuisine, from famine to fete, potatoes and tomatoes, a quite delish regret.
You turned from gold to scarlet, you danced in olive oil, while butter kissed the spot and lifted every boil. A scandal turned to splendor, a marriage born of toil. 2 nightshades on our table, our hearts could not recoil.
Impossible to trust you, impossible to deny. We spread you on our tables with a somewhat guilty sigh. 200 years later, the verdict has been set. Potatoes and tomatoes, our most delicious regret. But then the blight descended and gain turned into cost.
Our darling Spud betrayed us, 1,000,000 souls were lost.
We cursed you in our hunger, we swore we'd turn away. Yet absence only proved how much we need you every day. accusation, oh darling, lend an ear. It started out in hunger, but flavor sealed the vow. We can't imagine dinner without you both, not now. No longer mistrusted, no longer denied. We lift you up with joy, with nothing left to hide. From Naples to Dublin, we proudly do declare,
Potatoes and tomatoes,
we'll always keep you near. Oh, potatoes and tomatoes, we'll always keep you near.
Mansplaining is brought to you by Joe and Mark and nobody else. Music composed and performed by the Mansplaining House Band. Thank you for spending your time with us, and we'll see you next time.